In 1937, 4 fire lookouts took their jobs high above the Nisqually Valley, expecting a quiet summer of watching for fires. But strange shaking rocked the tower at sunset. Wild animals disappeared, and something began walking around their ridge at night. Then one foggy evening, a heavy weight landed on the roof. From that moment on, the crew realized the forest wasn't the only thing they were watching. So, before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I first went up to the tower in June of 1937, when the last of the snow melted from the higher ridges and the Forest Service started sending lookouts into the hills. Our post sat on a rocky hill above the Nisqually River Valley in Washington, 2 days walking from the nearest town and another half day from the ranger station. By the time we reached the ridge, the big trees turned into short, twisted fir and scattered rocks, and my legs hurt from the climb. There were 4 of us working at that tower. I was 23, and this was my first season. Sullivan was the leader, a quiet man in his 40s with wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and a slow way of moving that made it seem like he had already seen every kind of trouble. Hayes was big-shouldered and loud, always ready with a joke, always acting like cold weather and hard work were nothing to him. The last was Ruth, thin, dark-haired, quick in her movements and in her questions. We had met only 2 days earlier at the station, collected our maps and orders, and then started up the trail behind a string of mules carrying wood, food, and tools. The tower stood on a flat area of rock near the highest point of the ridge. It was a square wooden cabin set on tall legs with windows on every side and a narrow walkway around it. A ladder climbed from the bare ground up to the trapdoor in the floor. The boards were new and pale, still smelling of fresh wood from crews who had worked there before the snow. A metal pole rose from the roof to draw lightning away from the building. Inside, we found a narrow bed, a small wood stove with a short pipe, a map table with a special tool for finding fire locations, a shelf for canned food, and a square battery radio that the Rangers called our lifeline. We reached the place late in the afternoon. A thick layer of clouds hung over the hills, making the light flat and dull. The forest stretched away in all directions, dark and thick, broken here and there by bare cliffs and the pale line of the river far below. Patches of snow still stuck under shaded rocks. To the south, partly hidden by clouds, a big volcano rose above the rest of the mountains. People in town had told us it smoked now and then, even when the air was clear, and that it made strange noises during storms. Sullivan walked a slow circle around the rock, hands in his jacket pockets, studying the trees and the slope above us. "No burned tree trunks near the tower," he said. "That's good. Last crew didn't have to run from anything." Hayes dropped his backpack with a groan and stretched his arms. "I have no complaints," he said. "Better than digging ditches or swinging a pick. Up here we get paid for looking around." Ruth stood still for a moment and turned her head, taking in the ridge, the cliffs, and the tree line. "This place feels wrong," she said. "I can't say why. The forest is close, but it feels like it's holding back." Sullivan glanced over, but didn't answer. I told myself it was just the tiredness and the sudden quiet. We had left behind the noise of town, of wagons and axes and voices, and now there was nothing but wind, distant water, and the occasional clatter of loose rock. We spent the next hour unloading the mules and pulling everything up. We stacked crates at the bottom of the ladder and raised them with a rope and pulley one by one. The supplies were the usual mix: sacks of flour and beans, cans of coffee and sugar, canned meat and fruit, a crate of medical supplies, a bundle of spare clothes, a coil of cable, a saw for cutting wood, an axe, a canvas water bag, and a hand-cranked alarm we all hoped would stay buried in its box. Sullivan checked every item against a worn list with calm focus. "If we stick to our rations and the resupply comes on time, this will carry us through September," he said. Hayes leaned against the wall and wiped sweat from his forehead. "If the whole forest burns down, we'll be the last to hear about it. The whole point is to be the first to see smoke," Ruth said. She bent over the radio, checked the battery connections, and turned the dial until soft crackling filled the room. A moment later, a thin voice from the station came through. Sullivan gave our call sign, reported our arrival and the condition of the tower, then signed off. The crackling came back steady and low. By evening, we had claimed our corners. Sullivan took the space nearest the map table. Hayes rolled his blankets out under the east windows, saying he wanted the first light. Ruth and I agreed to trade turns on the bed. We ate bread and cold beans on the walkway, while the cloud layer shifted, just enough to show more of the distant peak. From up there, The valleys were nothing but dark forest and stone. No house lights, no roads, nothing that spoke of other people. The rangers told me these hills burn every few years, Hayes said between bites. Lightning, careless campers, those new rail lines. They want eyes everywhere. One of the loggers in town told me something else though, he said. We should keep our attention on the sky when night comes. Ruth turned toward him. Why the sky? He wouldn't say straight, Hayes answered. Only muttered about things that fly where no one can see them, things that stay away from sun. He said the forest is dangerous, but the cliffs and the high air are worse. Then he had another drink and laughed it off. I had heard old miners and farmers share stories over bar counters since I arrived in the state. Lights on ridges, strange cries, something big moving in the timber just beyond the lamplight. Every valley had some version of the same talk. Even so, the mention of the sky stayed with me. In training, they taught us to watch the trees, the smoke columns, the wind. No one had said a word about the air above the ridges. After we washed our tin plates with cold water from the canvas bag, Sullivan set the watch schedule. Day shifts were for scanning the horizon, checking the wind, and writing down temperature and humidity every hour. Night shifts were mostly there to keep the stove going and keep an ear on the radio for storm warnings, but he said someone should always be awake while the rest slept. At first, we'll sit up in pairs, he said, until the loneliness feels less sharp. That first night, Ruth and I drew the late shift. Hayes fell asleep quickly under the east windows, snoring in short bursts. Sullivan lay on his back near the map table with his hands folded over his chest, his breathing slow and steady. A lantern burned low beside the radio, throwing a small circle of light. Outside, the wind rose and pressed against the glass in short bursts. The clouds hid any stars or moon, turning the tower into a small bright box hanging over a dark mass. I took the flashlight, climbed out onto the walkway, and made a slow circle. I checked the window locks, the rope on the supply box, and the bolts on the ladder. The ground fell away on all sides. The treetops started far below the tower, their outlines just visible against the slightly lighter sky. There was no other building in sight. No road, no cabin, nothing. It felt like we had stepped off the map. Ruth joined me on the west side a few minutes later. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and leaned against the rail, looking toward the darker shape of the distant peak. "Do you hear that?" she asked in a quiet voice. I stood still and listened. At first, I caught only the usual sounds, the rush of wind, the distant thread of water, a faint creak from the tower frame. Then I noticed something under all of that, a low, drawn-out sound that stayed on one note for a long time before fading and starting again. It wasn't a howl or a shout. It sat at the edge of hearing, just strong enough that my chest felt odd when it rose. "Could be air moving through a gap in the cliffs," I said, "or some kind of rockfall far off." "Maybe," she said, but she didn't relax. Her hand stayed tight on the rail. "It feels too even. If you notice it again, tell me. I want to know how often it comes." We stood there until the sound faded, the wind shifted, and the usual forest noises returned. Still, even after we went back inside, I kept my ears tuned for that low sound, and sleep took a long time to come. The next few days settled into a routine that was steady enough to calm my nerves. We woke before sunrise, made coffee on the stove, and wrote down the first reading of the day. The sky stayed heavy with clouds, sometimes breaking just enough to show a pale patch of brightness where the sun should be. We took turns at the fire-finding tool, sweeping the horizon, calling out directions, and memorizing the shapes of distant ridges so that any new column of smoke would stand out. By the third day, I knew the pattern of the forest below. The valley to the north held thicker timber. The slopes to the west fell more sharply, and the south side showed more broken ground and bare stone. When the wind shifted, the smell of wet earth and pine drifted up to the tower. Now and then, we caught the distant echo of a tree giving way and crashing down, a single sharp event in the steady background noise. It would have been easy to think only about fire and routine, but small things started to bother us. One afternoon, while I tracked a cloud shadow moving along a far ridge, I noticed a quick dark shape cut across it at an angle that didn't match any bird I knew. It was there and gone in a heartbeat, too large and oddly shaped. I blinked and searched for it again, but the cloud shifted and the shadow broke apart. When I mentioned it to Sullivan, he nodded without comment and made a note in the margin of the log. "Anything you can't explain goes in here," he said. "I've seen enough strange reflections and tricks of light up here to know they pile up. If it's nothing, we forget it. If it repeats, we pay attention." Ruth heard that and came over to read the entry. You wrote large flying shadow, direction south to north, she said. No guess. If I guess and I'm wrong, the word will stick in my head, I said. I don't want that. She gave a short, thoughtful sound and went back to the radio. She had started to use the set more often, calling the station with small questions that didn't really need answers. She asked about weather trends, about lightning strikes in other areas, about reports of large birds. The rangers answered in bored or practical tones, unaware of the tension behind her voice. Hayes remained the loudest voice in the room, but his jokes picked up an edge. At night, when the wind rose, he would talk longer than necessary about card games in town, fights outside taverns, and workers who went missing and turned up days later, wandering with no clear memory. He always laughed after those stories, as if to push them into the category of nonsense. Yet his eyes often wandered to the windows while he spoke. The low sound we had heard that first night came back. The second time I noticed it, the sun had just dropped behind the clouds and the forest was sliding into a flat, gray gloom. I sat alone at the map table while the others prepared supper. The note rose slowly, deep and steady, and this time it lasted longer. It seemed to come from the direction of the high peak, though it never became clear enough that I could point to it. The tower floor carried a faint shaking that made the coffee in my cup tremble. I stood up and walked to the west windows. The forest looked the same as always. No rockfall, no visible cloud of dust, no aircraft. The sound slowly faded. When it did, the quiet felt heavier. Ruth looked at me from the stove. You heard it again, she said. Yes, I said. Longer this time. Sullivan set down his fork. Describe it. I tried to find words that didn't reach beyond what I felt. Even tone, very low, no breaks. I felt it more in my ribs than in my ears. It came from the high ground, but I can't be certain. We'll mark that too, he said. He opened the log, wrote the time in a short line. If the mountain is shifting, there's nothing we can do from here. If it's something else, I want to see how often it returns. After that, I found myself waiting for the sound each evening. I would step out onto the walkway at dusk and wait. Some nights it didn't come at all. On others, it came twice, separated by long stretches of wind and ordinary quiet. Hayes claimed he couldn't hear it, though once when the shaking felt strong enough to rattle a spoon on the table, he went still and stared at the walls with a tight jaw. Another sign appeared on a morning that started like any other. The air was damp and cold, and a thin mist hung over the treetops. Sullivan sent Hayes and me down the slope with axes to clear a small dead tree that leaned over the trail from the last resupply. The walk down through the stand of fir took only 20 minutes, but the change in feeling was sharp. Up in the tower, the world felt open despite the clouds. Under the tree cover, the light was dim and greenish. We moved in single file, boots soft on the needle-covered ground. We found the dead tree half rotted, its top caught in a fork of a neighboring trunk. While Hayes started on the base, I walked a short way along the trail to check for any other problems. That was when I found the first dead body. It lay just off the path, half hidden in low bushes. It was a deer, but its condition was wrong. The body was mostly whole with no sign of animals eating the main muscles. The head, however, was ruined. The neck showed deep tears, not clean cuts, and not the work of teeth I recognized. The skull looked crushed inward from above, as if something heavy had dropped onto it. I called Hayes over, and he pushed the bushes aside with the axe handle, then swore under his breath. The smell of blood was old but still clear in the damp air. No flies floated around it, which struck me as odd given the decay. Mountain lion? I asked. He shook his head. Mountain lions go for the back legs. They drag a kill and cover it. This is wrong. He bent closer. Look at the bark on these branches. Something scraped them on the way down. There are hairs stuck there. He pinched a small tuft and held it toward me. It was rough and dark, not like the deer's hair. We took the tuft and our description back to the tower. Ruth listened with sharp attention while we spoke. She wanted to see the dead deer herself, but Sullivan ruled against leaving the tower empty. In the end, we described it again in more detail while she sat at the log, drawing a simple outline of the site and marking where I had found the body. Could a bird have dropped it? She asked. Not from that height, I said. The branches above are too close together, and I saw no feathers, no sign of claws. Those marks are more like scratches. Bears climb, Hayes added. But they don't fly, and they don't crush a skull from above like that. Besides, there were no tracks. Sullivan listened in silence. When we finished, he drew a slow breath. We're not here to study animals, he said. Our orders concern fire, not wildlife. but I don't like things that don't fit known patterns. He turned to Ruth. Don't mention this on the radio. If the station thinks we're chasing stories, they'll hold it against us. So we just ignore it, she asked. No, he said. We write it down. We watch. If more appears, then we decide what to send down the line. That afternoon, the forest felt different to me. I checked the slopes more often, not for smoke, but for movement. A shape between trunks, a flash of motion above the tree cover, anything that didn't match with wind and branches. My eyes grew tired from the effort, and when I looked away, I saw ghost images of dark forms against the sky that faded when I focused on them. By evening, even Hayes had lost his easy manner. As we ate, he kept shifting in his seat and glancing at the trapdoor as if he expected something to push it up from below. When the low sound came again after dusk, he finally admitted he heard it. All right, he said quietly. That's no wind. It feels like a train passing very far away. Ruth frowned at the comparison but said nothing. She sat with her hands wrapped around her mug, eyes fixed on the western windows. The note grew, held steady and faded. When it stopped, the hair on my arm stayed raised. Later that night, I woke before my turn on watch and lay still listening. The tower creaked softly with each gust. Hayes snored. Sullivan shifted and rolled onto his side. I heard the faint crackling from the radio, which we kept at low volume even overnight. Under all that, there was something else, not quite a sound, more a sense of being watched, of weight in the air. I told myself it was only the loneliness and the memory of the deer. Yet sleep didn't return easily. When dawn came, the clouds sat even lower, pressing down on the ridge until the tower stood in a gray fog. We could only see a few hundred yards. Sullivan said we would keep to our logs and watch for any break in the layer, but he also pointed out that smoke would be nearly impossible to spot in those conditions. We moved more quietly that day. No one mentioned the dead deer or the sound. Yet every small noise drew our attention. The clatter of a loose board, the distant crack of timber, the sudden absence of bird calls. Around midday, I realized that I hadn't heard a single crow or hawk all morning. The air felt emptied of them. That change settled over us more heavily than any story told in town. The fog held through the afternoon and into the evening. It pressed against the windows in slow waves, thinning and thickening without pattern. The forest below lost its shape, turned into shifting outlines and uneven patches of darker gray. We rotated through our tasks, but each of us paused more often than usual, listening for movement or waiting for the low tone that had become part of our nights. When it finally rose after sunset, it felt closer. The shaking passed through the tower frame and into the floorboards with a steady pressure that made us all stop what we were doing. Ruth set down the pencil she had been using and stepped to the west windows. It's not the same distance as before, she said. It moved. Sullivan stood beside her. He narrowed his eyes at the fog outside. If it moved, it's not the mountain. It's something traveling through the air. Hayes remained at the table, hands flat, shoulders high. He kept his gaze on the ceiling as though expecting the boards to lift. If it's flying, it must be huge, he muttered. Nothing that big flies around here. The tone faded, leaving a ringing emptiness. For several moments, no one moved. The lantern on the map table flickered. I found myself thinking about the deer again and the crushed skull. The memory returned with too much clearness. We need to get eyes below tomorrow, Ruth said finally. There's something in these hills. Sullivan shook his head. Not unless the fog lifts. We won't wander blind. But we can't stay locked up every time the air turns, she said. If anything is moving through this ridge, we should know. You won't go alone, he said. When we can see better, we'll take a short sweep around the tower. Nothing more. Hayes let out a tired breath. Good. I want to know what's walking out there just as much as she does. I said nothing, but I felt the same pressure. The tower felt safe only because nothing had touched it yet. The more the fog shifted, the more I wondered what might be using it as cover. We tried to sleep early that night in pairs. I took the first watch with Hayes, who was unusually quiet. He sat near the stove, staring at the hot coals while I stood by the south windows. The fog made it hard to track distance or shape. Even the closest trees looked like smudges. An hour into our watch, Hayes spoke without turning. Something passed over earlier. I looked back at him. When? Right before the fog came in thicker, he said. I saw it from the east window. Only a shadow, but long wings, not like a bird. The shape was uneven, like it had arms and wings both. Why didn't you say anything? He raised a hand and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I thought it was tiredness, or I thought I made it up because of that story in town. But after hearing that tone again, I'm not so sure. I weighed his words. Hayes often made things bigger in friendly talk, but his voice now had none of that. It had the flatness of someone speaking a fact he would rather avoid. Did it dive? I asked. No, he said. It glided, too slow for the wingspan. Nothing about it made sense. I looked out again, trying to spot any sign of it, but the fog hid everything beyond the nearest branches. I returned to my post and forced myself to breathe evenly as the minutes dragged on. Near the end of our shift, when the coals had gone dim and the room was cooler, the fog got so thick so fast that the windows turned into blank panels. Hayes stood to add more wood to the stove. As he did, a sudden thump hit the west side of the walkway. It wasn't loud. It sounded like something heavy landing softly on wood, but the weight of it was clear. Hayes froze, hand hovering over the stove door. I kept still by the window, listening. The tower frame gave a slow creak, the kind it made when someone walked across the walkway. The steps were spaced unevenly, one a pause, then another slightly heavier, then silence. Hayes whispered, "Someone climbed up." "No," I said quietly. No ladder movement. The steps had come from above, not below. Something had landed on the walkway straight from the air. Hayes backed away from the stove until he stood beside me. Neither of us dared move closer to the windows. The fog outside glowed faintly from the lantern light inside, but showed no shadow. A claw scraped lightly across the wood. Then nothing. The sound ended quickly, but the quiet that followed was worse. My mind strained to catch any other movement, breath, weight, wings, but the tower returned to its usual creaking. We waited a long moment before Hayes whispered, "Should we wake them?" "Yes," I said. We didn't leave the windows. Instead, Hayes bent low and tapped the floor near Sullivan. The older man's eyes opened at once. He rose, saw our posture, and moved silently to the table. Ruth woke with a start when he touched her shoulder. "What happened?" she whispered. Hayes described the steps in a steady voice. I added what I heard. Neither of us tried to explain it beyond that. Sullivan listened without stopping us. When we finished, he took the flashlight, climbed the ladder to the trapdoor, and paused. If it's still out there, the light may draw it closer, so we use only the lantern through the glass. He lifted the trapdoor slowly. Cold air poured in. He looked around the walkway, then shut it again. "I see nothing," he said. "No damage, no tracks, but we'll check in daylight." He frowned and looked between us. "Did either of you open a window earlier?" "No," we answered at once. He nodded. "Then that scrape was on the outer boards. We keep the windows locked tonight. We stay quiet." We stayed awake together until dawn. None of us admitted it, but no one felt safe lying down again. The fog wrapped around the ridge all night, and nothing returned to the walkway. Yet I sensed we were being watched from beyond the light. When the sky finally brightened, the fog began to thin. Patches of forest appeared in the distance like pieces of a map slowly uncovered. The air felt heavy and still. Sullivan climbed out with Hayes to check the walkway. Ruth and I remained by the windows, looking around. After 10 minutes, Sullivan called up from below, "Come down slowly." We climbed down the ladder and stepped onto the rock. The fog around us had lifted enough to show details. Sullivan pointed to the far side of the walkway. The wooden railing showed 3 long grooves in the outer surface. They were shallow, but too clean to be from weather. The spacing suggested a large hand or claw. Hayes crouched beside it. "Those are fresh. Whatever made those stood here last night." Ruth knelt and ran a fingertip along the grooves. The wood dust is still soft. None of us said more for several breaths. The ridge felt changed. Whatever had landed here no longer felt far away or unseen. It had touched our only shelter. Sullivan straightened. "We tighten our area. No one leaves the ridge alone. We'll double the night watch. And if the creature returns, we use the alarm to warn the station." Ruth looked up at him. "Do you think it will come back?" He met her eyes. "Yes. It didn't land by accident." As we climbed back into the tower, a soft rush of wind moved across the treetops. It sounded normal at first, but then I realized the rhythm was off, too quick and too sharp. Not wind, wing beats. They passed overhead and faded into the distance before any of us reached the windows. I recorded the time in the log with a shaking hand. The forest had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that suggests everything beneath the tree cover is holding its breath. By midday, the fog cleared completely, leaving the ridge bare under a thick, still cloud layer. We could see for miles. The valleys looked washed out, the treetops flat and dark. None of us relaxed. Even with the air cleared, the quiet remained wrong. Birds didn't return. Small animals didn't rustle under the branches. It felt like the whole forest was waiting for something to happen. Sullivan told us to check the ridge more carefully. We moved in pairs. I went with Ruth toward the narrow rocky point west of the tower. The trail was faint, no more than a line of disturbed needles, but it let us move quietly. Our boots made soft, dull sounds on the ground, and we stopped often to listen. "Did you sleep at all last night?" she asked. "Not really," I said. "You?" "A little. Not enough." I kept waiting for that sound to come back or for something to land on the roof. She looked around the trees with steady, careful motion. "Whatever this thing is, it stays hidden until it wants to be seen. That worries me more than anything." We reached the edge of the rocky point. From there, we could look down into a shallow ditch full of broken branches and heavy undergrowth. I noticed a thin line of bent bushes halfway down the slope. Not quite a trail, but not random either. The branches were bent inward on both sides, forming a narrow path. "Do you see that?" I pointed. Ruth crouched and followed the line with her eyes. "Yes." Something large passed through more than once. We climbed down carefully, keeping enough distance between us to avoid slipping on the soft needles. When we reached the bent corridor, I knelt to look at the ground. It was hard to tell what direction the movement came from. The forest floor was pressed down but not torn. The marks were large and spaced unevenly, as if the creature had moved with long, heavy steps. Ruth touched a branch where several rough, dark hairs stuck. "Same type as near the deer. Same length too. This isn't from any animal we know." The air inside the ditch felt colder than the ridge, and there was a sour metal smell that didn't fit the normal sense of earth and pine. The smell seemed to come from farther down the path. Sullivan's whistle cut across the trees, a sharp two-note call. He used it only when he wanted us to come back quickly. We climbed out and headed back toward the tower at a quick pace. When we reached the clearing, Hayes stood beside Sullivan, holding a piece of torn canvas. "This was tied over the wood pile," Hayes said. "We found it on the north side of the ridge." Sullivan tapped the torn edge. "Something pulled it free with more strength than a bear, and the cuts are uneven. Some parts look torn, others look sliced." Ruth looked at the canvas closely. "These tears are angled, like claws from above, not from the side." We all looked toward the forest without meaning to. The open space around the tower suddenly felt too small. The idea of the creature testing the edges of our supplies sat heavily among us. "We strengthen everything," Sullivan said. "Canvas, crates, traps if needed, and from now on, no one leaves the tower after dark." Hayes folded the torn canvas under his arm. "If it wanted our food, why didn't it take anything? It only shredded the cover." "To see how we react," Ruth said quietly. No one argued with her. The rest of the afternoon passed in slow, uneasy work. We tied down the storage crates with rope and hammered spare boards over the gaps in the walls. Even the simple act of driving nails sounded too loud. I kept checking the sky, expecting a shape to appear at any moment. The clouds never broke. By evening, the air turned colder. A wind picked up from the south, steady and dry. We took our shifts on the walkway again, but the forest gave away nothing. No wing beats, no movement, no return of the low, rumbling tone. The silence came back heavier than before. Ruth made a stronger pot of coffee for the night watch. Hayes sat by the stove, hands wrapped around the mug, rubbing his thumbs over the ceramic as if trying to warm them. His usual loud presence had pulled back completely. When I sat beside him, he gave a hollow laugh. "All that noise I used to make," he said. "Guess it did nothing but cover how uncomfortable I felt up here in the first place." "You didn't seem uncomfortable," I said. "I was," he replied. "Only difference is now we all know it." He drank, then set the cup down. "If I see that thing again, truly see it, I'm not sure I'll keep my nerves." "You will," I said. "We all will." He nodded but didn't answer. The wind made the tower sway slightly. The lantern flame trembled. The quiet outside felt so complete that even our breathing seemed too loud. Near midnight, the low tone returned. It came without warning, deep and steady, stronger than any previous night. The windows shook. The ladder groaned. The floorboards shook. A cup on the shelf rattled against its neighbor. Sullivan shot to his feet. "Positions now." Ruth grabbed the flashlight. Hayes reached for the alarm, but Sullivan motioned sharply. "Not yet. Wait." I went to the west windows. The tone grew fuller, not louder, but heavier. The air felt thicker, as if something huge pushed it aside. Ruth whispered, "It's directly above us." I felt the truth in her words. The weight of the sound pressed down. The roof creaked sharply. A shadow passed over the lantern light, just a ripple, but enough to show that something moved across the roof in careful steps. A soft thud followed, then another, then silence. The tone faded slowly, as though the creature drifted away rather than left quickly. We held our positions long after the sound disappeared. When Sullivan finally spoke, his voice was low. "It's watching us, testing the tower. It knows we're awake." Ruth faced him with tight focus. "If it wants to break in, it will. These walls are thin." "I know," he said. "That's why we stay calm. Panic will only make us careless." Hayes breathed out shakily. "What do we do when it decides the test is over?" Sullivan didn't answer right away. He looked toward the ceiling, then to the trapdoor, then to each of us in turn. "We prepare," he said. "We keep the lanterns lit, and we wait for dawn." The rest of the night passed in tight silence. No more footsteps, no tones, no wing beats, only the tower shifting in the wind. When morning came, none of us had slept. The sky outside was the same dull gray as every day before, but it felt colder. The air had a raw edge that didn't belong to the season. We gathered on the walkway and checked the roof. At first, it looked fine. Then Ruth pointed at two boards near the edge. The nails had lifted slightly, as if something heavy had pressed down on them. A single long groove stretched between them. "That wasn't wind," she said. Sullivan nodded. "It was here. It will return." He looked out across the forest. His face had changed. The calm, experienced ranger was still there, but something harder settled behind his eyes. "Tonight," he said, "we won't wait for it to come to us." Ruth stared at him. "You want to go out?" "No," he said. "We want to see it before it sees us." A fresh silence followed. The decision formed among us without anyone pushing it forward. If the creature returned, the next move wouldn't belong to it alone. The forest below held no sound, no birds, no wind through the lower branches, not even the distant rush of water, just a stillness that felt ready to break. We all sensed it. We spent the rest of that day getting ready in a way that none of us would have tried a week earlier. There was no proper plan because none of us had any real idea what we were dealing with, but we knew two things. The creature grew bolder with each night, and the tower wouldn't survive a real attack. Waiting inside would trap us. We needed clear views, space, and warning. "We'll keep the lanterns burning in the tower," Sullivan said as we gathered around the table. "If it watches us at night, it expects to see light. We'll make sure it does." Ruth nodded. "So we get out before it arrives and circle above the clearing." "Exactly," he said. "We'll take the ridge trail west. That rocky point gives us a better angle over the roof. If it lands again, we'll see it clearer than it sees us." Hayes rubbed the back of his neck. "What if it decides to land on the rocky point instead?" "Then we move," Sullivan answered. "We don't stay in one place. We're not trying to trap it. We're trying to survive and understand what we're facing." The tools we had were simple: lanterns, one axe, one saw too heavy to carry far, a flare gun with two flares, and our voices, which were worth little against something that moved without fear. For most of the afternoon, the wind dropped to almost nothing, thin and cool. The fog stayed gone, but the cloud layer pressed close to the ridge. The forest remained strangely still. Even the bugs that usually bothered us showed no activity. I didn't see a single gnat or fly near the tower. We walked the ridge trail several times. Hayes remained close to the trees, looking up into the branches every few steps. Ruth walked ahead with strong focus, testing each patch of ground as if planning a route for escape. I followed them both, noting how the air felt heavier the farther we moved from the tower. Sullivan moved last, counting our steps and marking spots where we could take cover. When we reached the rocky point, we stood in a line and looked back toward the tower rising above the clearing. Its small windows reflected the gray sky like dull metal plates. The building seemed weak from a distance, nothing more than a thin-walled box balanced on legs. I realized then that the sense of safety it gave us was more fake than real. Anything strong enough to land on the roof could tear through the walls with little effort. "We stay low," Sullivan said. "No lanterns out here, just eyes and ears." Ruth lifted her chin. "If it lands again, do we fire the flare?" "Only if it's about to strike," he said. "The flare might scare it, or it might anger it. We use it when there's no other choice." Hayes swallowed. "And then what?" "Run. If the creature leaves, we fall back to the tower," Sullivan said. "If it doesn't leave, we go down the north slope. That forest is thicker. It might slow it down." I looked at him. "You think we can outrun it?" "No," he said, "but we might confuse it long enough to scatter. One of us reaching the station is better than none." We returned to the tower before sundown. The air got much colder after dusk. A fine cold seeped through the boards, even with the stove burning. None of us spoke while we prepared. Hayes double-checked the flare gun and tucked it into his coat. Ruth packed the lantern supplies, the matches, and the small notebook where she kept every detail she collected. Sullivan kept his jacket unbuttoned, so he could move quickly. I filled my pockets with chalk, so we could mark trees in the dark if needed. As the sky dimmed, the tower began to glow from within, a small bright square in a landscape without any other light. We left the lanterns on the table and the floor just as Sullivan wanted. From outside, the effect made the tower look lived in and unconcerned, a trick for the creature if it watched such things. When the last of the twilight faded, we slipped out the trapdoor one at a time, climbed down the ladder, and crossed the clearing without lanterns. The forest swallowed us quickly. The trail to the rocky point felt tighter than usual, as if the trees had grown closer without moving. The air carried no scent except cold pine and damp bark. We reached the rocky point and crouched behind the line of boulders. From there, we could see the tower clearly. The lantern light inside glowed warm against the windows. The building looked quiet, empty, unsuspecting. The forest around it looked flat and lifeless. Minutes passed. No sound came from the sky or the trees, not even the faint creak of branches. Ruth leaned closer to me. Her breath was steady, but her voice dropped to almost nothing. If it doesn't come, that means it knew we left. It will come, I said. I believed it more than I wanted to. Hayes shifted uneasily. What if it's already here, hiding in the trees? We would hear branches moving, I said. Would we? He asked. It landed on the roof without any warning. Sullivan raised a finger. All of us froze. The low tone began. We felt it before we heard it, pressure in the chest, a faint shaking in the ground, a weight in the air that made my breath tighten. The sound followed an instant later, steady and powerful, deeper than any previous night. This time it came from above. This time it came from the west, beyond the tree line. Ruth pointed. It's moving. The tone grew stronger, then steadier. The treetops in the distance swayed in a way that didn't match the wind. Something large passed over them, unseen but clear in size. The branches bent as if pushed by wide, slow-moving air. It's circling, Sullivan whispered. We crouched lower, barely daring to breathe. The creature's path was wide, looping over the forest in a smooth arc. It never came down. It passed over the ridge once, then again, each time at a slightly different angle. The tone got deeper the closer it came, filling the space around us until my teeth felt on edge. Then silence. The sudden absence of the sound felt sharper than noise. For a long moment, nothing moved. A single gust of wind crossed the ridge. Then the sky darkened above the tower, as though a shape slid into place between the clouds. Ruth's hand gripped my arm. The creature came down, its wings spread wide, then folded slightly as it angled downward. I could make out its shape against the dim clouds, broad chest, long arms, wings that ended in thick jointed points. Its fur looked darker than the night sky. Its eyes glowed in two narrow beads of amber. It approached the roof silently, without the rumbling tone, as though saving its strength. Then it landed. The impact shook through the entire clearing. Even from the rocky point, we felt the shaking under our feet. The creature crouched on the roof, its wings tight against its back, its long arms braced on each side of the cabin. Its head lowered, looking at the windows. Its back rose and fell with each slow breath. It's looking for us, Hayes whispered, barely able to be heard. The creature pressed its weight against the roof again. The boards strained. The nails lifted. The tower groaned. Ruth breathed out quietly. It knows the light is wrong. It knows no one is moving inside. The creature shifted. It leaned forward, claws scraping lightly across the boards. One wing unfolded halfway, as though it meant to tear through the ceiling. Sullivan breathed out once, steady and final. Hayes, he whispered. Not yet. Wait for my signal. Hayes tightened his grip on the flare gun. His hands shook, but he held steady. The creature lowered further. One clawed hand gripped the edge of the roof and pulled. A board cracked. Now, Sullivan whispered. The flare burst in a bright arc. A sharp streak of red light cut across the clearing and exploded just above the tower. The creature flinched. Then it turned not away toward us. It spread its wings wide, kicked off the roof with a violent burst of air. The tower shook as it launched skyward, its eyes fixed directly on the rocky point. And it came straight for us. The instant it launched from the roof, the air snapped against the ridge like a sudden shift in pressure. Its wings caught the darkness and folded into a dive so controlled and careful that none of us mistook it for instinct. It had chosen us. The flare hadn't scared it away. It had shown our position. "Move," Sullivan hissed. We scattered from the rocky point. The creature closed half the distance in a single glide. Branches below thrashed under the force of its wings. I threw myself behind a boulder as a heavy rush of wind swept over the ridge. Loose gravel lifted from the ground and stung my face. Ruth reached the trail first, boots sliding on the needles as she jumped down the slope. Hayes followed, clutching the flared gun even though it was now useless. Sullivan stayed behind long enough to make sure the creature hadn't changed its path toward them before he followed. I ran last. The forest swallowed us quickly. Branches slapped my arms as I went down. The slope angled too sharply for speed, and I had to grab onto trunks to keep from falling. Above us, the low tone returned much stronger. No longer steady. It pulsed in short, harsh bursts, each one shaking the air. I couldn't tell if it was a signal, a sound of effort, or something meant to confuse us. The creature swept overhead. Its wings smashed through the upper branches, snapping them clean. Bark rained down. A clawed shadow dragged across the tree cover with strong purpose. "It's driving us down the ditch," Sullivan called from ahead. "Stay tight. Don't separate." But staying tight became harder the farther we went down. Roots twisted underfoot, and the ground shifted with loose soil. Hayes nearly fell twice. Ruth stopped once to pull him upright, then pushed him on. I glanced back and saw the creature banking for another pass. Its wings barely moved. It glided with scary ease through the openings in the tree cover, adjusting its path with slight tilts of its arms. The amber glow of its eyes cut through the dimness. It knew exactly where we were. A sharp crack echoed behind us. I turned in time to see a large tree split halfway up the trunk. The creature had clipped it as it passed. Half the tree toppled downhill and crashed across the trail, blocking our direct route. "We go around," Sullivan commanded. He led us along a narrow slope that curved around the fallen trunk. The ground forced us toward the ditch. I heard rocks tumbling somewhere ahead and smelled the dampness of water pooling at the bottom. The ditch walls were steep. If we went down there, we would be trapped. "We keep to the side," Sullivan shouted. "Stay above the channel." The creature's next pass came lower. Branches tore free. Needles rained down like dry scraps. Hayes ducked as a broken limb slammed into the ground behind him. A sudden, sharp cry rang out. Ruth stumbled. I reached her first. A branch had sliced across her forearm, cutting through her sleeve. Blood came quickly, but she pushed me away. "It's nothing," she said. "Move." The creature climbed upward through a clearing in the tree cover. For a moment, I saw it fully, wings spread wide, chest rising, claws extended as if getting ready for another dive. Its fur rippled with the motion, showing the full size of its body. It was built for strength, not weakness. Whatever mix of traits it carried, none belonged to anything we were prepared to face. "It will follow us until we stop," Ruth said between breaths. "It will lose us in the trees," Hayes said weakly. But he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The ditch's edge narrowed. The rock shelf we were on had started to crumble, forcing us closer to the drop. Below, the channel widened into a cold, slow stream. Sharp rocks lined both sides. Sullivan slowed. His eyes flicked across the ground with the quick thinking of someone who had made hard decisions before. "We cross," he said. "The tree cover is thicker on the other side. If we move fast along the lower slope, it might not see us right away." "We climb down?" Hayes asked. "No. We slide," Sullivan said. "Controlled. No jumping." We moved together. The creature circled overhead, searching for an opening. Sullivan counted softly. 3, 2, now. We slid down the ditch wall in a spray of soil and needles. My boots slipped, and I leaned back to keep from pitching forward. The drop lasted only seconds, but my legs shook as I reached the bottom. The water was shallow and icy. We splashed across it, climbed the other bank, and scrambled under the thickest pocket of trees we could reach. The forest muffled some of the open-air sound, but the creature still passed overhead. Its tone echoed along the ditch walls, made louder in strange ways that made it hard to judge direction. Then it dropped lower again. The branches above us broke apart with loud snaps. The creature clawed through them one after another, clearing a path. It wasn't trying to grab us. It was driving us down the slope. "We follow the ditch, but we don't go into open ground," Sullivan said. We pressed forward with renewed speed. The slope angled downward for a long stretch. The trees grew thicker and closer, blocking most of the sky. The air felt heavier. My lungs hurt from the cold effort. Behind us, the creature forced its way through the tree cover again. A deep growl rolled through the trees, a sound I hadn't heard before. Not the low tone. Something more alive, more focused. A sound that told us it was close. "We're not losing it," Hayes said. His voice cracked. "We will," Sullivan said. "Once we reach the lower flats, keep moving." But we didn't reach the lower flats. The forest opened suddenly into a clearing, a wide, uneven space ringed by boulders and broken stumps. There was no cover, no fallen logs, nothing to hide behind. We stopped at the edge, breathing hard. "It will see us if we cross," Ruth said. "It will corner us if we stay," Sullivan replied. A rush of wind swept across the treetops. The creature lowered through a break in the tree cover, circling the clearing like a silent hawk. We had seconds. Sullivan looked to each of us. "Stay together. Cross fast. Don't scatter." Hayes took one step forward. The creature struck. It dropped into the clearing with scary force, landing between us and the other tree line. Dust rose. Its wings spread wide, blocking any path around it. Its chest heaved. Its eyes fixed directly on us. Then it stood fully upright. I felt every instinct in my body telling me to run. But Sullivan stepped forward. His voice was steady. "We're not here to harm you. We only want to leave." The creature tilted its head. Its breathing slowed. Its wings folded halfway. Ruth whispered, "It's listening." Sullivan took another step. The creature's claws tightened. Its muscles tensed. Then it lunged. The movement was too fast to track. One moment it crouched. The next it closed the distance in a single jump. I threw myself sideways as its arms swept across the clearing. Hayes rolled, screaming. The creature's claws tore through his coat and slammed him into the ground. Ruth screamed his name and ran toward him. "Ruth!" "No!" Sullivan shouted. The creature reared back to strike again, wings rising. Then another flare burst overhead. Sullivan had fired the second flare straight into the sky above us. The explosion of red light lit up the entire clearing. The creature pulled back, shielding its eyes with one arm. Its wings beat once, twice, ripping at the air. "Run!" Sullivan yelled. We pulled Hayes upright. His arm hung limp, but he stumbled forward with us. The creature roared, a harsh, rough sound that shook the clearing. We reached the far tree line just as it launched again. Branches shattered above us. I felt the rush of its wings at my back. Then the forest swallowed us. We ran until the tone faded, until the wing beats grew distant, until silence returned at last. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station well after dawn. What followed became a long blur of questions, disbelief, and the steady refusal of the officials to consider anything beyond a possible large, injured animal. They sent men to check the tower, but by then the roof had only the marks we already knew. No tracks, no feathers, no signs beyond the carved grooves and bent nails. Hayes survived, though his arm never healed quite right. Ruth filed her notes, only to be told they were unnecessary. Sullivan received praise for calm response to natural danger. No one believed us, but we knew the truth. I never returned to the tower. Ruth left the service the next year. Hayes moved east, away from mountains completely. Sullivan stayed, though he never took another high post. As for me, the forest has never sounded the same since that night. I still wake sometimes when the wind drops low and steady, and for a moment, I hear something under it, something deep and searching. If the creature still lives in those ridges, it has learned what we learned long before the officials dismissed us. It avoids daylight, it watches from the cliffs, it tests before it strikes. And it remembers.